Welcome to the Mets Pod. On today's show, we're joined by MLB Network and NBC Sports' Jon Morosi. We're going to talk about everything going on with Juan Soto, the man of July right now. Take a look at the Mets trade deadline options, maybe a little help in their lineup and some help for the bullpen. After we say goodbye to Jon, we're going to recap the Home Run Derby, talk about a gigantic draft for the New York Mets, and hand out some first half of the season awards on the show. So reminder, subscribe to the Mets Pod at Apple Podcasts, Spotify. You can watch on SNY's YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of the Mets Pod. I'm your host, Connor Rogers, joined as always by my co-host, Joe DeMayo. And we're going to kick things off today with our guest, Jon Morosi from MLB Network and NBC Sports. Jon, crazy time of year. We're really excited to have you. How are you doing today?
Outstanding, Connor and Joe. Happy All-Star Break. Happy trade deadline coming up. Happy MLB Draft week. You've got everything there. Happy Jacob deGrom coming back soon. A lot of wonderful storylines to address here today.
Yeah, and on a rarity for the Mets Pod, we're going to talk about someone that is not on the Mets, and that is everything going on with Juan Soto right now, dominating the headlines. I mean, Jon, I'm going to keep this one simple for you. How do you think this is going to play out? I think the biggest question everyone has right now is, will Soto be moved before this deadline? A lot of variables at play there. The question is, who will be involved? And if not, this will obviously drag on into the winter. So what do you see happening with Soto in the now?
Connor, I place the chances of a Soto deal by August 2nd at around 60-40 in favor of a trade. I do believe there's a slightly better than even chance that he's traded. And here's why. While I think it's always hard to find fair value for a player of this ability and this youth, because it's important to point out, Juan Soto is younger than 12 players who were in the futures game this year, as in last weekend. He is younger than 12 of the stars of tomorrow who have not yet arrived to the major leagues. Think about that for a moment. And that is why he is such a unique player on the trade market at the moment. Why would the Nationals trade him? Well, a couple of reasons. Number one, we know from the reporting of Ken Rosenthal and others over the weekend, they simply do not have an agreement or are close to an agreement on what a long-term extension is going to look like. They have tried. You have to give Mike Rizzo and the Lerner family who owns the club credit for trying. There is no possible way that any Nationals fan could say you offered $440 million, but you weren't serious about keeping him. That would be an absurd thing to say. And so they have tried. They have done right by their fans, by the organization. They have done everything they can do. And yet you look at it, and for me, I applaud the Nationals because it's important to try to keep your players. But if you look around and say, we're not close to winning, which they're not, and they're not able to sign them, which by all accounts, they're not going to be able to do so, you owe it to yourself and your fans to explore this trade, especially, and this is where I think there is a little nudge above 50-50 for me, the team's up for sale. And if a new owner comes in, once the approvals take place, that can happen, who knows, 6 months, a year. It takes a while. But let's say the new owner comes in this winter or next spring, and all of a sudden it's the trade deadline of 2023, and the first significant thing that a new owner does is trade Juan Soto. That is not exactly the thing that would endear a new ownership group to the fan base. And it's not their fault, by the way, nor is it the Lerner's fault, but it's still a difficult thing to have to deal with. Just take the Red Sox, for example, and trading Mookie Betts, and they're still hearing about it all these years later. So for me, that's what sort of nudges this above the 50-50 threshold. Those two things, the clarity with which everybody can see he's not signing there, and the uncertain ownership situation of the franchise going forward. Those two elements are what nudge this into more of a 50-50 situation than what I can see. Not by much, because I still think the bar is very high, But if you're ever going to trade him and get something close to full value, the time is the next couple of weeks.
Quick follow-up on Soto. Do you think there'd be any hesitation from the Nationals side to trade him in division to a team like the Mets? And would there be any hesitation from the Mets side to give up the prospect haul that would be necessary within the same division?
Joe, I think that's a very fair question. There's always a certain reluctance when it's the same division. I think that's been the case of any number of deals. I think it's always more challenging. But if the right deal is in the division, you take it. And obviously we know Steve Cohen, not afraid to make a trade or spend. We know the Atlanta Braves, look at the way they handled things last year at the deadline. Alex Anthopoulos, not afraid to make a big trade. So I think ultimately the Nationals have to make the best deal for the organization. And if that best deal is the Mets, the Braves, you do it. I also think that what I said just a moment ago was deliberately vague. And the best deal for the organization probably does not involve facing Juan Soto 18 times a year. Like that's probably not what's best for the Washington Nationals. I really believe that's the case. I think probably the best thing for him is to play in the American League West, play for the Mariners, play for a team that you're not going to see that often, that you don't have to deal with the notion of him coming back to town. Because just imagine this. Imagine if Mookie Betts were a Baltimore Oriole. Imagine if Mookie Betts were a New York Yankee. Perish the thought for the Boston Red Sox. As much as they're reminded of what a great player in person he is now, it would happen 4 or 5 times as often if he was in the same division. So I think that is the cautionary tale where Mets fans probably should temper their expectations about being seriously in the mix for Soto. But let's remember this, guys, that it behooves the Nationals to have it out there that the Mets are involved, because we all know what a driver it is when Steve Cohen is involved in anything that's competitive like this. It just helps to bid up the price. So I think from that standpoint, for the Mets fans, my sort of one level removed from this advice would be to not be surprised if you hear your team mentioned, but also to not get your hopes up too much, because I really don't think, if all things are equal, the Nationals want to trade him in the same division.
John, and I think one of my biggest lingering questions that I have no idea the answer to is how many teams will realistically pony up the, let's say, $500 million to keep Soto in the long term? And we know Steve Cohen is a guy that'll do that. We know there's franchises like the Yankees that typically won't have a problem doing that. But like, how big can this number get when you factor in the extension that you're assuming comes along with the Soto deal?
Well, I would actually take the different perspective and say, at this point, you have to assume it's just a rental.
Wow. Okay.
You have to.
Yeah.
Because, and again, if you're a team that has a really good working relationship with Scott Boras, and obviously the Mets just did the Scherzer deal with Scott a few months ago, so that's good, and that's maybe a point in their favor. But I really think, knowing what he just turned down, it's really hard to either have one of two scenarios. Either A, saying the trade is contingent on a deal happening, because in baseball, we don't often see the trade contingent on extension happening window occur. I candidly think that should happen more often than it does. I believe, if memory serves, that was the case for Santana all those years ago. But that's a pretty rare thing. I mean, I really cannot think. Adrian Gonzalez's extension with Boston was almost concurrent with the trade being consummated, but it is really rare in this sport. And obviously I cover hockey a fair amount as well. It's much more common in hockey. I think it's a healthier way to do things, but teams are always wary of losing leverage. And I think the Nationals' response is going to be, look, we got enough interest in this player right now. I don't have to do that for you to potentially disrupt the bidding that's going on right now to give you that chance to get an extension. So would it help if it's a team like the Dodgers or the Giants to say, hey, we've got the capital to sign him long-term. We believe we can do it. I think especially the Giants, because they were involved at different times. They were involved in the Harper deal. They were involved with Stanton when he was a trade candidate all those years ago. I still feel like the Giants have a spot in their payroll for a massive star that they've been kind of saving up for a while. And obviously Posey's retired now. They've got Belt and Crawford. Their deals are sort of beginning to sunset. For me, the Giants, because of how he fits their team in the future, are a really interesting candidate to land Soto. But I don't think it's going to be with an extension already in place. It's going to have to be, hey, we like the player. We've got the prospects to do this. And we believe that at the end of the day, we'll be able to work out the extension. But those are not concurrent elements. It's more of a sequential effect, I think, for whoever gets Soto.
Stepping away from Soto, what other players are you expecting to dominate the deadline talk? Is this the year that Luis Castillo actually gets moved? Feels like it's been a rumor for 2+ years now.
Yeah, I believe he does get traded. I think he's the best, certainly the best controllable arm out there. Of course, there is 1 year of control on Castillo beyond the end of this season. He's pitching really well. His changeup is one of the best pitches in the game. So I think when you line up all these elements, I do believe the Reds have shown that they're certainly open to listening to anybody and on anybody. And so I think from that perspective, I would expect that we will see Castillo traded. Would it be to a team like the Mets? Would it be to a team like the Dodgers? I think Castillo is probably going to a club that may be a little bit different than Soto, because you have the 1 year of control beyond this year to next season. It's going to probably be a team that maybe has the inclination to sign him long-term, because it's not going to be a Soto type deal. So I think the financial flexibility, in a sort of a paradoxical way, I think the ability to extend Castillo means that maybe teams that have the resources to do it, like the Mets, like the Dodgers, like the Giants potentially, are more in play for him. Whereas I think that the group that's looking at Soto, the number is so astronomical that I don't think anybody can afford it right now. And so it almost welcomes in the Tampa Bay Rays for Soto, whereas I think the Rays are not going to be a strong candidate to get Castillo. So I do think Castillo is traded. He'll be the pitcher that we talk about the most. I also think there's a number of rental arms out there, whether it's Jose Quintana with Pittsburgh, Martin Perez with Texas. I think there's going to be enough good rental candidates out there to talk about, but I think that the premier top of the market pitcher for sure right now is Luis Castillo of the Cincinnati Reds.
Looking Mets specific, we know their priorities are going to be bullpen help and getting a DH that can play above the level of what J.D. Davis and Dominic Smith have given them so far. And Sandy Alderson has been pretty public voicing that. What will those markets look like this year? Definitely, notably the DH market.
It's going to be interesting. I think one name that is going to be very popular among different contenders is David Peralta in Arizona. Now, he has not been a DH in his career, but he has been an outfielder. And I think there's a lot of different teams who are looking for that additional bat. I would even consider the Yankees in there, given the struggles of Gallo. I think for me, Peralta is a pro. He's been in the playoffs before, really good in the clubhouse. I think he is someone that I think would fit very well with the Mets, and will not really a first baseman, more of a DH type. You also wonder about someone like a Nelson Cruz. Obviously, Josh Bell would be a great fit, but certainly part of Bell's value is at least you think about him as a first baseman, and sources say the Mets have somebody who plays first base pretty well. So I think there's maybe not that same value proposition for Bell with the Mets. Somewhat interestingly, I think Dom Smith is going to be a name that people talk about this year at the deadline going out. And obviously it might be somewhat contingent for the Mets on getting that DH, or someone who is a nice complementary. Maybe it's a corner infielder with a DH component. But I think in the right ballpark, the right situation, Dom has certainly had stretches where he's been a really good major league productive hitter. I just think right now, with the way this team is constructed, he's just not going to get that same runway with the New York Mets right now. But I would, if I'm the Toronto Blue Jays, who have a real dearth of left-handed bats, I would take Dom Smith in a second and just give him a bunch of at-bats over a month and just see what happens. Because I think he's a player, their corner outfield spots have not been especially productive. Hernandez has been hurt. Gurriel has not really had that great of a year. DH wise, they consistently, against a guy like Garrett Cole, run out 8 right-handed bats. And you just should not be doing that if you're serious about finding a way to win the American League this year. So Toronto's going to find a way, I believe, to add some left-handed power. And for me, Dom Smith is a worthwhile gamble for a team like Toronto.
Does the expanded playoff format limit the amount of sellers that we're going to have this year? It feels like there's some teams that are on the fringe that could potentially hold tight with kind of a glimmer of hope for a wild card spot. And I think of Baltimore as a team that's obviously hot right now, and they're kind of on the fringe. And you mentioned Dom Smith, like maybe a trade based around Dom Smith and Trey Mancini could make sense, where Baltimore gets kind of a more controllable first baseman while selling a rental. But what do you think just overall about the playoff format impacting the sellers market?
I definitely think that there are some teams that to me are not really legitimate postseason teams. And by that, I mean a team that's going to win a round. And I'm talking to you, Chicago White Sox, who they continue to underwhelm. I've been huge fans of theirs in the past. I believe they were going to have a great team this year, and it just has not worked out. And to me, when a team underperforms for this long and struggles to break above 500 for this long, again, the standard of the American League, and this is where I think making the playoffs means something different to each individual team. For me, if I'm Baltimore, there is no chance I trade Trey Mancini for Dominic Smith, because for me, after asking my fans to be patient for so many years, I finally have an interesting team. And Trey Mancini is a hugely popular player in Baltimore. Don't screw that up. Like, your fans want to come to Camden Yards in September and have hope. And even if, to your point, maybe the right asset management move is to move out Trey Mancini for Dom Smith, at some point in time, you need to move out of the asset management business and move into the entertainment and competing business and winning your fans over business and winning their hearts over business. And that, all of those elements for me point to Trey Mancini. I would be much more understanding of the Orioles keeping Trey Mancini than the White Sox keeping Lucas Giolito and Josh Harrison and Johnny Cueto, because they're in a different competitive part of their cycle. The White Sox have had a chance, they've had a window, and they have not delivered. Baltimore is just beginning its window. So I think they have, if I'm not mistaken, the exact same record right now. But I'm much more bullish on Baltimore staying in this thing because of the context of what it means to their team. Look at the White Sox. They've made the playoffs the last couple of years. The standard right now, if you're a legitimate contender, or at least should be a legitimate contender, like the White Sox, like the Angels, for example, can you beat Houston or New York in a 5-game series? And the answer is no. Now, and so for those teams, like the Angels, clear sell Syndergaard, who is having just an okay year, but still the Angels aren't going anywhere. Seattle, you got to try to make the playoffs. You've not made the playoffs in 21 years. So I'm giving you sort of a subjective answer. And the answer is that sort of it depends on who we're talking about. But I really believe you have to take each individual franchise into consideration here and say, what are you trying to do here? What is your objective? And where are you at with your competitive journey? And a team like Baltimore, they needed to deliver to their fans something real. And something real is at least competitive baseball in September. The White Sox have been there, done that. They know what a competitive team looks like. And this is not it, unless there's a massive change for them in the last couple of weeks before the deadline. So I really think when you've got a league right now like the American League, which I look at a little bit differently than the NL, the AL so clearly, the two best teams in that league are so clear to me that you have to ask yourself, if you're Toronto, and probably one of the reasons why they let go of Charlie Montoyo, are we close to beating the Yankees in a 5 or a 7-game series? Can we beat Houston in a 5 or a 7-game series? The answer was a resounding no. And if the answer is a resounding no, you'd better make some adjustments. And unfortunately for Charlie, it was making a change at manager. But I'll be really curious to see how Toronto handles things the next couple of weeks. They're a team that I believe should be one of the most aggressive in the major leagues right now.
Yeah, and we saw them do it last year, getting Barrios, so that would not be too shocking there. All right, in the spirit of us handing out first half of the season awards later on today's show, John, a really broad question. What have been your impressions of the Mets this first half? They had a huge winter. They spent a ton of money on the external free agent market. They've made some big trades. It's only the first half of the season, but what have been your biggest takeaways with this team?
Pete Alonso obviously is in the MVP conversation. I'm still waiting for Lindor to really be himself. I think that's one question that I've got. I think for them going forward is what will he be able to offer? I think that while Alonso is the MVP candidate from this team outwardly to the world, I think watching this team and having covered a number of their games during the course of the year, I think the catalyst of this team is Starling Marte. I think when Marte is stealing bases and on base and hitting for power and doing what he does, this team starts to look pretty darn unbeatable. And that to me is the player that I'm going to watch in the second half. I know he had some times where he was away and different moments where he wasn't able to be in the lineup every day, but you can tell how well he has gelled with this group. They love him. His teammates really love him. I think the return to form of McNeil has been a really important story. Nimmo is always on base. This is a team that I think, while at times offensively, when it's not Alonso at the plate, they can occasionally underwhelm you 1 through 9 because they don't really have this is not the Yankees lineup. It's not. It's a good lineup, but what I like about them is I think that when it comes to October, they will hit good pitching. I think Nimmo hits good pitching. McNeil hits good pitching. Guillorme is an underrated, really good hitter who gives you a professional at bat and is a really good defender. Those are the kind of guys that you win with. Escobar had sort of a disappointing first half, but on measure, I like this team. And I'll say this. I don't care what your payroll is. I don't care how much money you spend. When you miss the guy who was supposed to be your opening day starter in DeGrom and the guy who was your opening day starter in McGill, who I think was one of the really good underrated pitchers in the game to begin the season, and then Max, look, you're going to have some inconsistency. I don't care who you are. Those are three, like when McGill is right, we already know how good Max and DeGrom are. I think McGill's one of the 20 best starters in the National League when he is healthy. I think he's that good. And so when you miss that amount of talent early on in the season, it's not the same. And so now that you've got DeGrom coming back, and I love that it's going to potentially be during the Subway Series, which is just amazing. I think it's you've now had an opportunity as the New York Mets to really get to know your roster. I think Buck Showalter, when it comes to September, October, because of the injuries, and obviously it was not a good story when the injuries have been happening, and still McGill, there's a lot of concern. Buck Showalter knows how to use a roster 1 through 26. I think he's one of the best managers in the sport in all the years I've covered it at maximizing every roster spot. And for better or worse, he has had a real get to know you phase with a lot of different players who had to be relied on that you maybe didn't expect to be relied on because of injuries. And so I think that now when you get to October, there's a lot of guys that have been trusted on into pretty big spots who Buck is going to call on again. And I just think Buck was the right manager to hire for this team in this time. Instant credibility, really good, both analytically and sort of the human side of the game. And so I think Buck has done a really good job first half of the season. And I think the Mets hired the right guy. And I think that their structure overall, just the underpinning of the organization, which all of you know better than I do from living it every day, this is the most stable they have been in a long time. Just when you look at owner, GM, manager, field staff, coherence, clubhouse leadership, this is the most consistently professional they have been in a really long time. And I think it's a crucial thing to be able to say about the organization right now.
You mentioned the stability with the organization, and obviously we cover it day to day, and the Mets fans are excited with everything that Steve Cohen has brought to the organization. But you cover baseball from a national perspective. How do other teams perceive the Mets now under Steve Cohen? Because I think obviously there was always the LOL Mets thing, and that was just kind of the running joke throughout the league. I think things might have changed.
Oh, they have changed. And there's a certain fear, I think, like we always used to in free agency. I think back to a decade or more ago, the winter when the Yankees signed CeCe and Burnett and Teixeira all together. Of course, they went out and won the World Series the next year. And that winter sort of instilled, and that there had obviously been the Steinbrenner effect for long before then. But I think that winter, at least in the time I've been covering the game nationally, was a pretty demonstrative moment where you said, okay, like the Red Sox cannot sleep easily ever because they never know when the phone call goes from Scott Boras to Brian Cashman that says, hey, this is the best offer from Boston. Can you beat it? And he says, yeah, I can. And so Teixeira's a Yankee, and they went out and won the World Series. I think now there's that same level of fear from other teams about what Steve Cohen can do. And I think it carries over to the deadline, because when you have a decision, and I've been lucky to cover this game for a long time, and I cover hockey a fair amount as well. When fans ask questions of me when I'm just out and about here in Michigan where I live or wherever I'm at, and the questions come about, why didn't we do this? Or why did this team do X or Y or Z move? The answer is almost always a variation of one of these two things: money, and it's what the owner wanted to do. They're not always the same things. I mean, maybe I should say resources as opposed to money, because I think that Cleveland's payroll is what it is. They traded Lindor because of their financial reality. And so when the Tigers went out there and Victor Martinez blew out his knee, and a week later Mike Ilitch signed Prince Fielder, it's because that's what the owner wanted to do. It didn't make sense with the budget. It was what the owner wanted to do. And now the Mets have an owner for whom and about whom it is said, well, if it's what the owner wants, it's going to happen. Darn the luxury tax, darn what the payroll number we thought was going to be. And that's, look, it's exciting to be a Mets fan right now. It's both thrilling and challenging to cover the team if you're a beat reporter, because what was said wasn't possible on Monday is all of a sudden possible on Wednesday because the owner changed his mind or it became an option all of a sudden. So it's fun, I think, to follow this team. And consequently, for the Braves, it's frightening. If you're a Phillies person, it's frightening because the Mets are never out of it. They're never out of a free agent discussion or a competition for a pitcher at the deadline or in the offseason. So I think for me, Steve Cohen is a game changer in the entire sport. And certainly for Mets fans and the confidence they have, they know that my team's owner is looking into everything. And if it makes the team better, there's a darn good chance it's going to happen. Like there's really, you can count on one hand the number of fan bases who can say that with absolute confidence. The Dodgers, I think, have that level of credibility. The Yankees have had it for a while. The Mets have it. Sometimes Boston has it, but then again, Mookie Betts isn't there anymore. So do they really? I mean, this is a very elite group of franchises, really, in all of pro sports. When you think about it, everybody else has a cap. Everybody. In the NHL, they've got a cap, NBA, NFL. So Steve Cohen owns a New York franchise in a sport without a salary cap. Like, that is a unique set of circumstances. And I think Mets fans are appropriately grateful for the current reality in which they operate.
Trust me, John, the Mets fans are absolutely loving it. He is Jon Morosi, MLB Network, NBC Sports. Man, we've had a lot of fun talking to you. I know this is a crazy time of year, so thanks so much.
Thanks, Connor. Thanks, Joe. Keep up the great work, and we'll have to do this again later on. I do think there will be reasons to talk Mets baseball in October as well.
Absolutely, John. Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, Joe, before we move on, let's go back to Juan Soto, right? We had pretty long discussion with John, obviously, who had great details on the Soto market externally, what's gone on in Washington. I think we need to put the classic Mets prospect hugger on the spot here, Joe. If you ruled Mets world, and we often talk on this show like we do, we have a lot of fun with that. We've had fun that way for years. Do you go, it's as simple as this, Joe. Do you go all in on a deal for Juan Soto? And honestly, you know this as much as anybody, better than anyone. What does that actually look like?
It looks like a lot, I think is the best
everything?
way to put it. Yeah, pretty much everything. I mean, you have to imagine you're starting the deal with Francisco Alvarez and Brett Baty and then taking it from there, which is pretty crazy to think about. I came into this show, and obviously this was in the rundown for us to talk about, basically saying, if you told me that I was re-signing Juan Soto to a 10-plus year deal, then the prospect costs more or less doesn't matter. Juan Soto is the age of some of these prospects, but he's already an established top 3 player in baseball. But after that interview with Jon Morosi, and he seemed to imply that if you trade for Juan Soto, he's not signing an extension. He may see through to free agency.
I don't think there's time right now.
Yeah. If that's the case, that I am not. Maybe it's not an immediate extension. It's not Johan Santana where you have 72 hours to make a deal or there's no deal. But if I'm making this trade, I need to have an idea from Juan Soto and his camp that, yes, I'll be willing to talk extension with the Mets starting now, and let's figure something out. May not be immediate, but let's talk it through. If I can have that assurance, then I think I'd be kind of foolish to say the Mets need to hold on to prospects. But if you're working out this trade and Juan Soto's camp goes, all right, you got Juan Soto for the next couple of years, but then he is going to free agency, I'm going to pump the brakes a little bit. I know that's going to be unpopular amongst people listening, and I'm sure some people are yelling at me right now. But I don't necessarily want to hand over the complete farm for just a couple years of a player as elite as he is, and then to watch him go sign with the Yankees or go sign elsewhere. So I think it's definitely contract dependent, but this is very NBA, like where all of a sudden, out of nowhere, one of the best players in the sport is just magically on the block. So it's an exciting time for baseball as a whole, and it's certainly something that Mets fans should keep an eye on.
I think it's a fair stance. I think when it comes down to it, obviously you don't see players like this on the trade market, right? The fact that this is a 23-year-old megastar, that it's hilarious to people saying he's having a down year and his OPS is over 900. A down year for a 23-year-old with an OPS over 900. Batting in a lineup where there's not really much of anything around him, to keep that in mind. So, but I do think you're right. There's context that needs to be at play here. The fact is, if you're giving a Godfather offer, which Soto is well worth, but it's well worth it if Soto is your franchise player for the next 12 to 15 years, not for 2.5. So I think that's the most important thing. I'm sure this will not be the last time we talk about Juan Soto on this show. It's not going to be the last time we talk about everything going on in the Mets farm system on today's show. But before we do that, you are listening to the Mets Pod. Subscribe to the Mets Pod at Apple Podcasts, Spotify. You can watch on SNY's YouTube. Watch all of our clip outs on SNY's social platforms as well, or wherever you get your podcasts. All right, Home Run Derby. Pete Alonso could not three-peat, taken down by the J-Rod show from the Mariners. Obviously, I think... when you look at this, Joe, not the biggest news in Mets land. It almost feels like it ran its course. Pete had a lot of fun with the Home Run Derby. We know how serious he takes it. I think it's been great for the Mets brand and for Mets fans to watch Pete in the Derby. But at the end of the day, I also think it speaks to nobody has done this 3 times in a row. I know Ken Griffey Jr. did win 3 times in general, but it kind of speaks to this is a really, really hard event to be the king of year after year after year.
It's definitely a hard event to dominate, and Pete Alonso has largely done so. I mean, like you said, winning 2 in a row, going for 3, and yesterday he was just hitting line drives, and they were coming up just short, hitting the wall. So he was hitting the ball hard. He just wasn't really elevating it. But, I wonder if this is the last we see of Pete Alonso in the Home Run Derby. I feel like it was probably one of those things that he was going to keep doing it if he kept winning, if he kept making all-star teams. I wonder if after this it's like, all right, well, that was really awesome. I did it for 3 years, but now I'm actually going to take the All-Star break. If he makes the All-Star team, obviously play in that, but then take the rest of the All-Star break and just kind of chill.
This to me, Joe, my odd takeaway was it felt like a bit of the passing of the baton for Pete to not just be a young face in the MLB that you're introducing to the national audience, and now the goal for Pete is to remain an MVP candidate from actual baseball games and take the Mets to potentially a World Series. And I know that's a weird way to look at him losing the event, but I think the Home Run Derbies when he was even younger, dominating, was a lot of fun. But I think for Mets fans right now, it also showed a little bit of a focus of we care so much about making the playoffs, making a World Series, Pete having potentially his best season yet, that this is one of those things where it didn't feel the same as your typical Mets loss.
I mean, I guess that's a way of looking at it. I didn't think of correlating losing the Home Run Derby to being a contender, but I do think, for the most part, it does feel like the Home Run Derby, to your point, I think the best use of the home run derby is to show off the young stars of the game that, I mean, let's be honest, if you're listening to this podcast, you're a diehard Mets fan, you may know who Julio Rodriguez is. But how much Julio Rodriguez baseball have you watched outside of maybe
Yes.
highlights on MLB Network? Now you actually get to see his personality, you get to see his swing, and I think that that's really what this event should be primarily about, promoting the young players in the game that have power, that are exciting parts of the future. And yeah, Pete, I think, ran his course there. It was awesome the last couple years. We'll always have those sick memories of Alonso just mashing dingers at the Derby. But now it's time for the Mets to go ahead and make a push for a World Series.
Yeah, on to bigger things. All right, but taking a step back, obviously the MLB Draft started Sunday. Mets had 2 first-round picks. I know you've had a ton of coverage on SNY.TV, on SNY's Twitter, and all their social platforms for this. Let's start with the 2 first-round picks here, Joe. Obviously, a guy that people thought would be off the board was their first pick in Kevin Parada, the Georgia Tech catcher, coming off a monster year with 26 home runs, deemed as maybe the best college hitter in the draft. I'll just throw this one your way. What did you think of the value of Parada? And do I really have to ask you to go down the road of explaining why drafting a catcher is okay in the MLB draft, that this will not conflict with Francisco Alvarez's future?
So the most dreadful part about this draft, the draft pick for me, when they made it, the first thing that popped in my head was not, wow, the Mets landed a top 5 player on my board and someone that, talking to people throughout the game, throughout the whole draft process, he was considered a top 5 lock. And
Wow.
But my first thought was, I'm going to have to field questions about Kevin Parada and Francisco Alvarez. But as far as purely value, it's a credit to the Mets. And I had mentioned this on my spot on Mets pregame live. And I said this to you on the podcast over the last couple of weeks, that the Mets had the ability with their extra draft picks and their bigger draft bonus pool to be opportunistic and aggressive. And that's exactly what they did in selecting Kevin Parada here at number 11 overall. Like I said, top 5 player on my board. He fell into their lap, and they just took him. Don't worry about Francisco Alvarez. Worry about the future in the future. The MLB draft needs to be about drafting the best possible players you can, get them into the system, and just let it all play itself out. I did actually reach out to a couple people outside of the Mets organization yesterday asking about Parada and Alvarez, because I knew this question would come up, and they said, Kevin Parada has some work to do defensively. Average receiver, kind of fringy arm. One thing that stuck out is one person from another team that's a high-level scout said, yeah, we kind of evaluate Kevin Parada as a left fielder. So I wonder if there's
Good
going to be
athlete.
some positional flexibility in his future. But you're buying the bat with Kevin Parada. He's going to hit for average. He's got an unorthodox swing setup, which was kind of a trend in this draft. Like, if you watch his highlights, it looks like he's like lugging a bag of golf clubs over his shoulder while he's waiting for the pitch. And then he gets in perfect position and, he hits the ball hard to all fields, set the Georgia Tech record with 26 home runs this year. You're getting a true hitter that can do average, power, and be a middle of the order threat.
So we know the Mets farm system has been deemed as a little bit top heavy. Francisco Alvarez and Brett Beatty are in the top 20 of MLB Pipeline's top 100 prospects in baseball. Ronnie Mauricio has been hovering around the top 50. Alex Ramirez has cracked the top 100 as well, Joe. Does Parada slide into the top 100 prospects in baseball, you think, consensus-wide?
I would say yes. I mean,
Wow.
maybe not consensus, but for a good percentage of the rankings out there, I think Kevin Parada is a top 100 prospect. I know that Kylie McDaniel at ESPN, when he did his draft rankings, he actually labeled the players like
Where
when
they
they
slot
get
in.
drafted, this is where they'll slide in the top 100. And he said Kevin Parada would be the number 77 player on his top 100. So the Mets landed a top 100 prospect at a unique position.
All right, so let's touch on the other first-round pick in Jett Williams. Joe, this was kind of funny to me because leading up to the draft for a couple of weeks, we've been texting. I've been asking you the famous question of, okay, who are the stars that can slide? We talked about Elijah Green. We've seen Kevin Parada in a lot of mock drafts. And one thing that you followed up with was, let me tell you about the guy that I think should go higher than where he's projected. And it was Jett Williams. And a lot of mock drafts had him around 20, 21, 22. The Mets take him at 14. when you read about Jett Williams, Joe, the only thing you see that is the knock on him is that he's 5'8", 5'9", and he's a high schooler. What was your overall takeaway with this pick? A high school shortstop that everybody loves the bat.
So I'm going to pat myself on the back. I actually had Jett Williams going to the Mets with the 14th pick in my final mock draft. So I got one right. That was awesome. But
you got the hard one right.
I got the hard. But Jett, my personal favorite player in this class.
Wow.
He's not the highest ranked player, but this is a baseball rat, high IQ, instinctful player, plus athlete, plus bat the ball skills. I mean, the only player that probably has better pure bat the ball skills in the high school class this year was Tamar Johnson, that went number 4 overall to the Pirates. Like you said, I don't think power is going to be a massive part of his game, but this is a guy that never swung and missed on the showcase circuit. There were some evaluators that said he was the best high school bat on the showcase circuit last year. So very impressive prospect. I think he's going to transition more to a second baseman or center fielder at the next level. But this is the type of player that I think Mets fans will fall in love with. He's got the cool name Jett the Met. That's what I'm kind of going with. And he's just gonna hit, man. And it's not a lot of comparisons because of his size. He's 5'8", maybe, but he's a ball of energy, and Mets fans are gonna love him.
All right, for everyone listening that wants more MLB Draft, Joe's been giving his thoughts basically on every single pick at PSL The Flushing on Twitter, SNY.TV. You've had a ton of content, so you could stay right there. And as always on this show, we will check on the development of these players. We will check in on the farm system, as we always do. But let's get into some first half of the season awards. And we're going to have fun with this. It's not just going to be just team MVP or best defensive player, things like that. Joe, I'm going to kick this one off with one of my favorites, the Sky Miles champion. This is the player that was not necessarily sent up and down the most, but out of that pool of players that is constantly traveling back and forth, that you think quietly made a great impact on this team.
I feel like the answer has to be Adonis Medina.
Everybody loves him.
Everyone loves him. He seemingly was the 27th man for every single doubleheader this year, and that doesn't count towards your send up and set down quota, which now you're limited to 5 options per year before having to expose someone to waivers. But Medina seemingly was up and down plenty, and the Mets actually at times put him into some really big spots, and he kind of consistently came through. So pretty good first half from a waiver claim from the Pittsburgh Pirates, and you wonder how the Pittsburgh Pirates didn't have room for a guy like this on their roster.
Yeah, you really do. It's funny, when I was reading about Medina, he was once upon a time a big-time prospect for the Phillies. I know you know this, Joe. I think people, casual prospect followers like me, I was like, wow, Medina not that long ago was a big-time prospect for the Phillies. It didn't work out, had a cup of coffee with the Pirates, and now ends up helping the Mets win ball games. I do want to throw in a little bit of an honorable mention here, a recent one, in Yohan Lopez, who is another one of these guys that goes back and forth. I think everybody loves his attitude and what he brought to the club earlier in the year against the Cardinals. But most recently, Joe, he's a guy in his last 3 appearances has not given up an earned run in, almost 6 innings for Lopez. So he's someone that, listen, are you relying on him in high leverage 8th innings? No, but when you have these double headers or you have a game where you need an extra arm, he has not been a dud at all. He has been effective for the Mets.
Hey, talk about high leverage. He pitched the 9th inning of a game against the Cubs and
put himself in some high leverage.
Put himself in some high leverage, but still he pitched in a big spot and came through. And yeah, he was the enforcer of sorts earlier in this year when the Mets kept getting hit. He was the one that was like, I don't care, I'll throw at someone.
It was awesome. All right, the unsung hero of the team in the first half of the season, Joe.
I'm going David Peterson. And
I like it.
I think he's a guy that really held this rotation together because obviously the Mets haven't seen Jacob deGrom yet, which, exciting news. Seems like he's on the mend, and if everything goes well with his throw down at the Complex League here, I think it's today, Tuesday, that he's doing it, then he should be back here in the coming days. But obviously with Jake, Tyler McGill spending multiple trips on the injured list, Max Scherzer missing a bunch of time, the Mets needed more than just Taijuan Walker and Cookie Carrasco to come through. And David Peterson just has quietly been fantastic. His slider's one of the best sliders in all of baseball right now. And he's quietly striking out a bunch of batters, and his ERA is around 3.5. So I think David Peterson, definitely an unsung hero, and that really kept this rotation intact throughout the first half.
And I'm going to stick with an arm, but a bullpen guy. Once again, we've talked about Luis Guillorme so many times on this show. I don't think it's fair to call him an unsung hero at this point. I'm going to go with Adam Ottavino here, Joe. With Ottavino, some of the early season, I hate to say blow-ups, but struggles kind of started to take away or gave him a reputation of a guy that's untrustworthy. Let's just call it like it is. In the month of June, with a lot of work, 1 earned run, surrendered. In the month of July, a lot of work, 1 earned run, surrendered. Ottavino, really since a kind of shaky late April into early May, has been nearly lights out for this team in the bullpen, where they've needed help without Trevor May.
At the beginning of the season, it seemed like Adam Ottavino was just that 1 year, $3 million guy that just hangs out in middle relief, and you pitch him in the 6th, the 7th, whatever. You just find the right spot to use him. But with some struggles with Seth Lugo and Drew Smith being a bit up and down, like you said, Adam Ottavino has stepped up in a big way, and he's been the primary setup man. So, yeah, a great first half for, a New York guy, and, a 1 year, $3 million investment. Good job by the Mets staff.
All right, Mr. Extension. Which player, because of their first half that has a pending free agency, needs to become Mr. Extension in the winter? Joe, I think everybody knows what you're going with here.
Extend the best closer in baseball. What are we doing here? Edwin Diaz needs to be a Met for the long term. He's figured out the New York market. His mechanics have been much better this year. You're seeing much less of those frisbee sliders that kind of float up there and get mashed for homers. His location on his fastball has been crisp. How many guys has he gotten looking on just 100 on the black? He's missing bats at an unreal rate, and Josh Hader struggling a bit of late. So I'm calling Edwin Diaz the best closer in baseball, and the Mets need to make sure that he's a Met for the foreseeable future.
And I think he will be, and I think everybody will agree with that, with the resurgence that Diaz has had. He has been truly unbelievable. Obviously, some other candidates for this list: Brandon Nimmo, Taijuan Walker, who will probably decline his player option, and Chris Bassett is expected to hit free agency as well. Joe, I can't believe I'm the one saying this, but Mr. Extension to me is Brandon Nimmo. And I think there's a couple layers to this. One, I actually think there's a middle ground with Nimmo, that he doesn't need a monster deal, that you can find a reasonable deal to keep him around into his 30s. He's a 29-year-old player. He actually he's been good this year, right? Hovering around that 800 OPS, getting on base, but he's not getting on base at his typical 400 clip. I think Nimmo's in for a big second half. He's a catalyst. Another one of the most important factors of keeping Nimmo around long-term, Joe, he just keeps getting better in center field.
He's getting better in center field. He's hitting for some more power, hitting the ball with force to the gaps. And like you said, he may not be drawing walks at quite the same rate. It's still a big-time rate that he's drawing walks, but just not quite at Nimmo level. But he's seeing as many pitches as almost anyone in baseball, and he's not afraid to go and hit a ball with authority. It seemed like in his younger years, he was up there trying to draw a walk, and he would hit the ball kind of if he had to. Now he's willing to take the walk, but he's not afraid to swing, and he's much more consistently barreled up the ball. And yeah, Brandon Nimmo feels like a guy that you would very much like him to be a Met for the next few years as well.
All right, best Buck moment or quote. What do you got for me here?
Oh man, I'm torn between a couple. When him getting ready to go fight after Lindor got hit in the head,
Undefeated.
I think that probably takes the cake. But how awesome is the graphic and great work by the SNY cameramen? Every time a Met gets hit by a pitch, it's like camera on Buck, and his just reactions when his batters are getting hit are priceless. But Buck Showalter is quite the character, and I knew he was before the Mets hired him, but I don't think I quite grasped it, and he's been a complete breath of fresh air for this team.
He really has, and he's been A great baseball manager at the end of the day through all of it as well. And I can't wait to see the Buck collage at the end of the year of all of his moments after a Mets batter has gotten hit. I think a low-key one for me was in spring training when he talked about the voodoo bucket, the giant drink with the million straws. Just picturing Buck Showalter drinking out of the voodoo bucket. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, all you have to do is search on SNY TV's Twitter, Buck Showalter voodoo bucket, and that will come right up. It's been a fun first half with Buck Showalter leading the way. All right. A little more simple one here, Joe. What's been the biggest surprise to you?
I'd say, and this may not even be surprising to some people, but Taijuan Walker repeating what he did last year in the first half. I mean, Walker's always been a pretty good pitcher when he's been on the mound. Obviously, last year he pitched like an all-star. This year, he did it again. Pitched like an all-star. He didn't end up making the game out in LA, but I don't think I had the expectation that Taijuan Walker would repeat 2021. But he did, and in some ways, even a little better than last year. So that definitely surprised me in a good way.
I'm going to go with one here, and this is probably the only time I'll do this on the show, but I would say surprising in a disappointing way. I'll be the first to say it. I'm very surprised by Eduardo Escobar's first half of the year, and I do think there should be some optimism for him to not be a offensive force in the second half, but to revert back to the player that he typically is. He's never going to be a guy that's constantly getting on base or working long at-bats and drawing walks. But, Joe, this is a guy with me that has way too much power, way too much ability to hit the ball in the gaps, to drive in runs, that I've been very surprised by how much he has struggled in the first half of the year. And I think that while I don't think he'll be a star in the second half, I think it'll be much better for Escobar.
It almost has to be, right?
How can it not be?
Yeah, but he's shown some signs of life over the last 3 weeks or so, where you've seen some power. He had a pretty good series against the Cubs, but it feels like Escobar will have a 2, 3, 4 game stretch where it feels like things are looking good, and then he'll go, one for his next 11. It's just like, okay. So it's been a weird first half for Eduardo Escobar, and hopefully in the second half you see that power that provides 25-30 home run a year pop, which is what he's historically done. So maybe a better second half is coming for Escobar.
All right, the only one that we're not going to make a trophy for, and that is biggest disappointment. What's been your biggest letdown so far?
My biggest letdown, it feels maybe not as significant as some other things, but Seth Lugo kind of being much more down than up. We'll often talk about guys being up and down, and that's frequently that comes with being a bullpen arm. But it feels like Seth Lugo is just not the same as he was. The velocity's not there consistently. He's very rarely up to that 97. Now you're seeing a lot of 93s and 94s. The breaking ball's not quite as crisp. I just think, it doesn't mean he won't bounce back here in the second half. But Seth Lugo coming into the year was the eighth inning guy behind Edwin Diaz, and then Trevor May would fall in line and Ottavino and downward. But I think it's at the point now where Seth Lugo's maybe the fourth option behind in the bullpen at this point.
Wait till the deadline.
Yeah, it's been definitely a disappointing year for Lugo, and like you said, I think part of Lugo's performance is a reason why the Mets are going to be pursuing maybe more than one reliever here in the next 2 weeks.
Joe, the biggest number to note for me with Lugo is strikeouts over 9 innings, 8.7. The 3 years before that, he's a guy that's hovering over 11 traditionally. So that goes back to your point, velocity, the can't hit kind of stuff out there. That's what makes so many relievers effective. And for extra innings, especially nowadays, getting that ghost runner on, that's a vital, vital number, and it's just not clicking for Lugo. My biggest disappointment, and I guess you can go back to my answer with Escobar, but to me the biggest disappointment, and this could be the biggest excitement for the second half, is we have not seen Max Scherzer and Jacob deGrom pitch on back-to-back days, Joe. And I think while that was the biggest disappointment of the first half of this year, it can be the most exciting thing for Mets fans in a very, very long time during this stretch run.
Get ready for it. It's coming, and I cannot wait.
It's going to be awesome. All right, Joe. First half awards in the book. We obviously had a great conversation with Morosi. Closing thoughts on today's episode of the Mets Pod.
Enjoy the All-Star break, because Mets are coming back with San Diego out of the break, and
struggling San Diego, surprisingly.
Struggling San Diego, so maybe the All-Star break's good to them, but ultimately, we're less than 2 weeks here from the Mets making some additions, so stay tuned here. We're going to talk about all things leading up to the deadline and then recapping whatever is done at the deadline. So definitely an exciting couple weeks, and going to lead to a great late summer and fall for the Mets.
All right, reminder everyone to subscribe to the Mets Pod at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks so much. We'll catch you next week.